The last person Ethan Carter expected to save his life was the man he had once pretended not to know. Years earlier, Ethan had stood beside 3 wealthy business associates when an aging mechanic crossed the street toward him, smiling proudly, his hands stained with grease and his faded work shirt carrying the marks of another long day. One of Ethan's colleagues had casually asked, "Do you know that man?" Ethan looked at his father, Samuel Carter, then at the expensive suits surrounding him. For 3 terrible seconds, ambition defeated gratitude. Ethan lowered his voice and answered, "No, not really." Samuel heard every word. He stopped walking, held his son's eyes for a moment, then quietly turned around and returned to his garage. He never confronted Ethan about it. He never demanded an apology. But years later, when Ethan lost his company, his money, his reputation, and almost every person he called a friend, he discovered what Samuel had done for him. And the truth would leave Ethan wishing he could return to that afternoon and change just 3 words. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this is not simply a story about a successful son and his mechanic father. It is about the dangerous moment when achievement begins to change the way we see the people who helped us achieve it. It is about a father whose hands became rough so his son's life could become easier, and a son who became so concerned with appearing successful that he almost erased the person responsible for his greatest opportunities. Ethan would eventually understand something many people discover far too late. Sacrifice does not always arrive wearing expensive clothes. Love does not always speak beautifully. Sometimes love wakes before sunrise, comes home smelling like gasoline, postpones its own dreams, and quietly pays bills nobody else knows exist. But before Ethan could understand any of that, he first had to become the man Samuel had always hoped he would be. Samuel Carter had spent most of his adult life underneath cars. By 6:30 every morning, the metal shutters of Carter Auto Repair were usually rising while most of the neighborhood was still waking. The garage sat near the edge of a modest American town where Samuel had lived almost his entire life. It was not impressive from the outside. The sign was old, the waiting area contained mismatched chairs, and a battered coffee maker had survived longer than several employees. But people trusted Samuel. He knew engines, transmissions, brakes, alternators, and the peculiar noises old cars made when something was about to fail. More importantly, customers believed him when he told them what their cars needed. Samuel had never gone to college. He sometimes struggled with paperwork and asked his accountant to explain documents twice. Yet he understood work, responsibility, and the importance of keeping his word. He had built the garage slowly, one customer at a time, never imagining that decades later his own son would look at the place with embarrassment. When Ethan was born, Samuel's ambitions changed almost overnight. Until then, Samuel had imagined expanding the garage, perhaps purchasing the property beside it and adding 2 more service bays. After Ethan arrived, the extra money began going somewhere else. Samuel opened a savings account for his son. At first, the deposits were tiny. $20 one week, $50 another. Whenever a customer paid an unexpectedly large invoice, Samuel sometimes transferred a little more. He never told Ethan. To him, parenting was not something that required applause. It was simply the job he had accepted the day he first held his son. When Ethan was 6 years old, he loved visiting the garage. He would sit on a stool beside Samuel's toolbox, asking endless questions about engines. Samuel gave him a tiny flashlight and allowed him to inspect cars that were safely raised. Ethan would proudly tell customers that his father could fix anything. Back then, grease on Samuel's hands was not embarrassing. To Ethan, those hands belonged to a hero. Ethan's mother, Margaret, often laughed at how closely the boy followed his father. If Samuel walked to the garage on Saturday morning, Ethan wanted to go. If Samuel washed the family car, Ethan appeared with a sponge. If Samuel opened the hood, Ethan immediately stood beside him. Samuel occasionally joked that one day the garage would belong to Ethan. But as Ethan grew older, Samuel noticed that his son had different gifts. Ethan was intelligent, articulate, persuasive, and fascinated by business. He could sell candy bars for school faster than anyone in his class. Teachers told Samuel that Ethan should consider university. Samuel took those words seriously. He had left school young because his own family needed money, and although he never complained about becoming a mechanic, he wanted Ethan to have choices. From that point forward, the garage became more than Samuel's livelihood. Every oil change, brake replacement, and engine repair became part of a private mission. He was not merely repairing cars. He was financing a future. There were sacrifices Ethan never noticed because Samuel worked hard to make sure he did not notice them. When Ethan needed tutoring after struggling with advanced mathematics, Samuel quietly postponed replacing an aging hydraulic lift. When Ethan joined a school program that required travel, Samuel worked an extra Saturday each month. When Ethan needed his first laptop, Samuel told him it was an early birthday gift. Ethan never knew that Samuel had planned to replace the garage computer that same month, but continued using the old machine for another 2 years. Margaret understood. Sometimes she would find Samuel at the kitchen table late at night, calculating tuition estimates and household expenses with a pencil. She would tell him that Ethan could take student loans like everyone else. Samuel always gave the same answer. He wanted his son to begin adulthood looking forward, not backward at a mountain of bills. He knew he could not pay for everything, but whatever burden he could carry himself was one Ethan would not have to carry. Then the Carter family suffered a loss that changed both father and son. Margaret became ill when Ethan was 17. What initially appeared manageable became more serious, and within a year Samuel was balancing hospital visits, garage expenses, and Ethan's final year of high school. Ethan watched his father become quieter during those months. Samuel would spend the day repairing cars, visit Margaret after work, return home late, and wake before sunrise to do it again. Margaret eventually died shortly before Ethan left for university. Samuel rarely spoke about his grief. The garage remained open because bills still existed, and Ethan's acceptance letter sat on the refrigerator like a promise the family could not abandon. On the morning Samuel drove Ethan to campus, they packed everything into an old pickup truck. As they stood outside the residence hall, Samuel hugged his son and told him something Ethan would remember years later. He said, "Never be ashamed of where you started. Just make sure where you started is proud of where you end up." At university, Ethan discovered a world much larger than the town he had known. Some students came from families with names people recognized. Their fathers were attorneys, physicians, executives, professors, investors, and business owners whose companies had offices in several states. Ethan listened as classmates casually discussed expensive vacations and internships arranged through family connections. During his first year, he still spoke proudly about Samuel. When people asked what his father did, Ethan answered that he owned an auto repair shop. But as time passed, Ethan became increasingly aware of status. No single person transformed him. There was no dramatic moment when someone ordered him to become ashamed of his family. Instead, a collection of small experiences began changing him. A joke about mechanics here, a comment about small towns there, a classmate talking dismissively about people who worked with their hands. Ethan laughed along occasionally, even when the jokes made him uncomfortable. Slowly, his old confidence about his background began fading. Samuel noticed changes long before Ethan realized he was changing. During Ethan's first year, he called home several times each week. By the second year, calls became shorter. By the third, Samuel sometimes left messages that Ethan returned days later. There was always a reason: classes, internships, networking events, meetings, dates, projects. Samuel never complained. He simply told Ethan to work hard and take care of himself. On holidays, Ethan returned home wearing nicer clothes and carrying himself differently. He corrected Samuel's pronunciation occasionally. He suggested replacing the old furniture. He complained about the smell of the garage entering the house when Samuel came home. None of those comments seemed enormous by themselves, but Samuel understood their direction. His son was moving into another world. What Samuel did not know was whether Ethan would bring his family history with him or quietly leave it behind. Still, Samuel remained proud. Every achievement Ethan mentioned became another story Samuel told his customers. Graduation should have been one of the happiest days of Samuel's life, and in many ways it was. He closed the garage for the entire day, something he almost never did. He bought a new shirt, polished an old pair of dress shoes, and wore the best suit he owned. The jacket was slightly outdated, but Samuel stood in front of the mirror that morning looking more nervous than he had at his own wedding. He carried Margaret's photograph in his wallet because he wanted, in some private way, for her to be present. When Ethan's name was announced, Samuel rose before nearly anyone else in his row. He clapped until his hands hurt. Ethan saw him from the stage and smiled. For several seconds, he remembered the father he had worshipped as a child. Then, after the ceremony, classmates and their families began gathering. Ethan watched one friend introduce a father who owned a financial company. Another introduced a mother who was a surgeon. Samuel approached wearing his old suit, and something inside Ethan tightened. Samuel hugged Ethan proudly and told everyone within hearing distance that his son had worked harder than anyone he knew. Ethan smiled, but he was distracted by Samuel's hands. Even after scrubbing them repeatedly, decades of mechanical work had left permanent marks around the fingernails and small scars across the knuckles. Ethan suddenly wondered what his classmates thought. Samuel had no idea. He spent the afternoon taking photographs, thanking professors, and telling people stories about Ethan as a child. At one point, Ethan asked him to stop talking about the garage. Samuel looked confused but nodded. The moment passed quickly, yet it marked another small shift between them. That evening, Samuel drove home alone because Ethan was attending a celebration with friends. During the drive, Samuel placed the graduation program on the passenger seat. Later, he framed it and hung it in his office at the garage. To Samuel, the degree represented everything the long days had been for. To Ethan, it represented his entrance into a world he increasingly wanted separated from the one Samuel inhabited. Ethan moved to Chicago after graduation and accepted a position with a growing consulting firm. He was good at the work. He understood people, spoke confidently in meetings, and had an instinct for recognizing what clients wanted before they explained it completely. Promotions came quickly. Within several years, Ethan decided he could build something of his own. He left his secure position and created Carter Strategic Solutions, a small consulting company that initially operated from a rented office with 3 employees. Samuel was terrified by the risk but never told Ethan to stop. Instead, he mailed him a handwritten note saying he believed in him. Ethan kept that note in a drawer but rarely looked at it. Business grew faster than expected. A major client recommended Ethan to another. Within 2 years, the company employed more than 20 people. Ethan moved into a luxury apartment, leased an expensive car, and began appearing at events he once would have only read about. Samuel celebrated every success as though it belonged to him personally. Whenever Ethan's company appeared in a local business publication, Samuel printed the article. The office walls at Carter Auto Repair gradually became a museum of Ethan's achievements. There were graduation photographs, newspaper clippings, a photograph of Ethan beside a city council member, and even a screenshot of an online interview Samuel had printed despite its poor quality. Customers who had known Ethan since childhood heard endless updates. Samuel would point toward the pictures and say, "That's my boy." Ethan, however, mentioned Samuel less and less. When colleagues asked about his family, he usually said his mother had passed away and his father owned a small business back home. He rarely explained what kind. The omission seemed harmless. Ethan told himself that his personal history was irrelevant to professional conversations. But deep down, he knew the truth was more uncomfortable. He enjoyed being perceived as someone who naturally belonged in the world he had entered. Success surrounded Ethan with people. There were dinners almost every night, messages every morning, and invitations every weekend. People laughed loudly at his jokes. Younger entrepreneurs asked for advice. Salespeople competed for his attention. Investors invited him onto boats and into private clubs. Ethan began believing that these relationships proved something about him. The more attention he received, the more distant his old hometown seemed. Samuel continued calling every Sunday evening. Sometimes Ethan answered from restaurants, telling his father he only had a minute. Sometimes the phone rang while colleagues were nearby and Ethan allowed it to go to voicemail. Samuel never stopped calling. His messages were usually simple. He wanted to know whether Ethan was eating properly. He wanted to know whether his car needed servicing. He reminded him that there was always a bed at home. Ethan smiled at the messages occasionally, but he almost never returned home. There was always another meeting, another opportunity, another reason that seemed more urgent. Then came the business trip that would remain in both men's memories for years. Ethan was traveling with 3 executives who represented a potential expansion opportunity for his company. The trip placed them less than an hour from Ethan's hometown, and during lunch one colleague suggested they visit the place where Ethan grew up. Ethan hesitated, then agreed. He told himself there was nothing to be embarrassed about. They drove through the familiar streets while Ethan described the town with the detached amusement of someone who believed he had moved beyond it. He pointed out his old school and the restaurant where teenagers used to gather on Friday nights. Eventually they stopped near the center of town for coffee. Carter Auto Repair stood across the street. Ethan noticed the garage immediately. For one moment he considered suggesting they leave. Before he could, the garage door opened and Samuel stepped outside carrying a wrench. Samuel recognized Ethan's car. His entire expression changed. He had not seen his son in months, and he began walking across the street almost immediately. He wiped his hands repeatedly on a shop rag, but grease still covered his fingers. His work shirt was faded blue, with Samuel stitched above the pocket. One boot had a patch near the toe. Ethan watched him approaching and suddenly became aware of every detail. Beside Ethan stood executives wearing expensive watches and tailored jackets. Samuel raised his hand and smiled. Ethan's heart began pounding for reasons he would later struggle to explain. There was nothing shameful about Samuel. Nobody beside Ethan had insulted him. Nobody had even reacted. The judgment Ethan feared existed largely in his own imagination. Yet when one executive noticed Samuel walking directly toward them and casually asked Ethan whether he knew the man, years of insecurity compressed themselves into a single moment. Ethan could have said, "That's my father," for words would have changed the memory forever. He could have crossed the street and hugged Samuel. He could have introduced the man who paid for tutors, school trips, university expenses, and countless opportunities Ethan had forgotten to calculate. Instead, Ethan looked briefly toward Samuel and answered, "No, not really." Samuel was close enough to hear him. His smile disappeared, but only for a second. He did not shout Ethan's name. He did not expose him in front of the executives. He did not demand respect. Samuel simply stopped. Their eyes met. Ethan knew immediately that his father had heard. Samuel gave a small nod, almost as though Ethan were merely another stranger passing through town, turned around and crossed the street again. The executives continued their conversation. Within seconds, everyone except Ethan had moved on. But Ethan watched Samuel disappear into the garage and felt something he tried very hard to ignore. Ethan spent the rest of the afternoon pretending nothing had happened. The meeting went well. His colleagues complimented the town. One of them even mentioned that the mechanic across the street had looked friendly. Ethan changed the subject. That evening, he drove back to Chicago and told himself Samuel would understand. He constructed explanations that protected him from admitting what he had done. He had been caught off guard. The timing had been awkward. His colleagues were discussing important business. Samuel's appearance might have created questions. Every excuse sounded weaker than the one before it. Ethan considered calling his father several times but did not. Pride told him the conversation would be uncomfortable. Days passed, then weeks. Samuel continued his usual Sunday calls as though nothing had happened. That made Ethan feel worse. There was no anger to fight against, no accusation to defend himself from. There was only the quiet kindness of a father who had been humiliated by his own son and had chosen not to humiliate him in return. Samuel had not forgotten. On the afternoon Ethan denied knowing him. Samuel returned to the garage, placed the wrench on his workbench, and sat alone in his office. The graduation photograph was still hanging on the wall. So were the newspaper clippings. For a long time, he stared at them. Walter Hayes, Samuel's oldest friend and occasional helper at the garage, found him sitting there after closing time. Samuel eventually explained what had happened. Walter became angry immediately. He told Samuel that Ethan needed to be confronted. He said no father deserved to be treated like that after everything Samuel had done. Samuel listened without interrupting. Then he quietly told Walter that Ethan was trying hard to become someone, and perhaps the old garage reminded him of the life he was trying to leave behind. Walter asked the obvious question, "Doesn't it hurt?" Samuel looked toward Ethan's graduation photograph before answering. Of course it hurt. But hurt, he said, did not cancel fatherhood. Samuel never removed a single photograph. He continued talking about Ethan to customers. When someone congratulated him on his son's success, Samuel smiled exactly as he had before. That was the strange imbalance at the center of their relationship. Samuel publicly claimed Ethan everywhere he went, while Ethan had privately begun editing Samuel out of his story. Yet life has a way of testing the identities people construct for themselves. At the height of Ethan's success, Carter Strategic Solutions appeared stronger than ever. The company had expanded rapidly, leased a larger office, hired additional staff, and signed contracts that made Ethan believe he had finally reached permanent security. Revenue figures looked impressive. Ethan was considering opening a second office. He had become so accustomed to upward movement that he interpreted momentum as stability. There were warning signs, however. Too much revenue depended on one major corporate client. Expenses had increased faster than cash reserves, and several new hires were supported by projected deals that had not yet been signed. Ethan's finance director urged caution. She recommended slowing expansion and building a larger reserve. Ethan listened, thanked her, and continued forward. He had spent years proving he belonged among successful people, and slowing down felt too much like admitting uncertainty. Then the first call came. The company's largest client had undergone a leadership change and was terminating several outside contracts, including Ethan's. The loss was enormous, but Ethan told employees there was no reason to panic. 2 major deals were expected to close soon. One did not. The other was postponed. Suddenly, the numbers Ethan had admired looked completely different. Payroll arrived every 2 weeks regardless of whether clients paid. Rent remained due. Loans remained due. Software subscriptions, insurance, taxes, contractors, and travel expenses did not care about confidence. Ethan began spending mornings looking for new clients and nights studying spreadsheets. For the first time in years, the future stopped obeying his expectations. At first, Ethan assumed his network would protect him. He had spent years building relationships with investors, executives, entrepreneurs, and wealthy acquaintances. Surely one of them would help. He began making calls. The responses surprised him. People who once answered immediately suddenly took days to respond. One investor who had repeatedly told Ethan that he considered him family said the timing was unfortunate. Another promised to introduce him to potential clients and never followed through. A friend who had enjoyed dozens of expensive dinners with Ethan stopped returning calls entirely. Invitations disappeared. The social world Ethan had mistaken for loyalty began shrinking with extraordinary speed. There was no dramatic betrayal involving one villain. Something more painful happened. People simply became unavailable. Ethan discovered that some relationships had been attached to his usefulness, his access, his reputation, or the possibility of future opportunity. Once those things weakened, so did the relationships. Each unanswered call forced Ethan to reconsider what he had believed success meant. Within months, Ethan sold the expensive car. He told people he wanted something more practical. In reality, he needed the money. Next came investments he had once promised never to touch. Then furniture. The large office became impossible to justify. Employees were called into individual meetings and told positions were being eliminated. Some cried. Ethan apologized repeatedly. A few were angry. Others hugged him before leaving. The company that had once made Ethan feel enormous slowly contracted around him. Eventually, there was almost nothing left to contract. Carter Strategic Solutions closed its main office. Ethan tried operating alone from his apartment, but the remaining debts followed him home. He stopped posting online because he no longer knew how to present his life. The photographs of conferences, luxury restaurants, and business events remained visible to strangers, creating the illusion that Ethan still inhabited a world that had largely disappeared. At night, he sometimes scrolled through those photographs and wondered how many people pictured beside him would answer if he called. One Sunday evening, Ethan sat alone in an apartment that looked noticeably emptier than it had months earlier. His phone rang. The screen displayed one word, Dad. Ethan stared at it. Samuel had continued calling throughout the collapse, unaware of how serious things had become because Ethan had hidden almost everything. Pride had survived even after money began disappearing. Ethan did not want Samuel to know his successful son had failed. The phone nearly stopped ringing before Ethan answered. Samuel immediately asked whether everything was all right. Ethan said he was fine. There was a short silence. Samuel had spent a lifetime diagnosing machines by listening carefully to sounds other people ignored, and apparently he could do something similar with his son. He did not accuse Ethan of lying. He simply said that if Ethan ever needed to come home, his room was still there. Ethan tried to laugh. Samuel repeated it. Your room is still here. After the call ended, Ethan sat in darkness for nearly an hour. 3 days later, Ethan packed 2 suitcases into a modest rental car and drove toward the hometown he had spent years treating like a chapter he had finished. Every mile felt like a confession. He imagined Samuel asking questions Ethan did not want to answer. How much money had he lost? Why had he expanded so quickly? Why had he ignored warnings? Where were all the successful friends whose names Ethan used to mention? And perhaps worst of all, would Samuel finally mention the afternoon outside the garage? Ethan almost turned around twice. But when he reached his childhood home, Samuel was standing on the porch. There was no lecture. Samuel walked down the steps, took one suitcase from the trunk, and asked whether Ethan had eaten. That simple question nearly broke him. Ethan had returned expecting judgment and found dinner. The room Samuel promised was still there exactly as he remembered it, with a few boxes added and an old photograph of Margaret resting on the dresser. For several days, Ethan said little. Samuel went to the garage each morning and returned in the evening. Ethan slept late, answered emails, and attempted to find consulting work. He was embarrassed each time he heard Samuel's truck in the driveway. At 35 years old, the man who once employed dozens of people was living in his childhood bedroom. Then one evening Samuel found Ethan sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by financial documents. Ethan finally stopped pretending. He explained everything. The lost client, the failed deals, the debt, the office closure, the employees, the friends who disappeared. He admitted that his savings were almost gone and that he had no idea how to rebuild his reputation. Samuel listened without interrupting. When Ethan finished, he expected advice about budgeting or warnings about arrogance. Samuel instead said something simpler. You lost a company. You didn't lose yourself. Ethan looked away, but Samuel continued. A business, he explained, was something Ethan had built. If he built one once, he could build something. Ethan told him it was not that simple. Starting again required money he did not have. Clients were cautious. Credit was difficult. His confidence had disappeared. Samuel nodded. Then he said, "Start smaller." Ethan almost became irritated. Smaller sounded humiliating to someone who had spent years measuring progress through expansion. But Samuel explained that almost everything worth building began smaller than people remembered. Carter Auto Repair had started with one bay and borrowed tools. Samuel had spent his first year working alone. There had been weeks when he was unsure whether the garage would survive. Ethan realized he knew almost none of this. As a child, the garage had simply existed. He had never considered the years of uncertainty that came before stability. Samuel told him failure was not proof that a man was finished. Sometimes it was simply the expensive price of learning what success had failed to teach. Those words stayed with Ethan long after Samuel went to bed. Over the following weeks, Ethan began building a modest plan. No expensive office, no large staff, no image to maintain. He would offer specialized consulting services directly to smaller businesses, using skills he already possessed. The numbers were reasonable, but one problem remained. Ethan needed enough money to settle immediate obligations and fund several months of operations. Samuel asked what amount would make the plan possible. Ethan refused to tell him. He knew the garage produced a comfortable but modest income, and he would not take his father's retirement savings. Samuel did not argue. A week later, he asked Ethan to accompany him to the bank. Ethan assumed they were discussing a small loan. Instead, Samuel handed him an envelope containing documents and a cashier's check. The amount was far larger than anything Ethan expected. Ethan stared at the figures and immediately asked where the money had come from. Samuel gave an incomplete answer. He said he had made arrangements. Ethan pressed him. Samuel simply said he had been preparing for retirement anyway. Something about the explanation bothered Ethan. Samuel had never mentioned retirement. In fact, only weeks earlier he had talked about replacing equipment at the garage. Ethan refused the check, but Samuel pushed the envelope back toward him. He told Ethan it was not a reward and not a rescue from responsibility. It was a second chance. Ethan could repay him someday if that made him feel better. After an argument, Ethan finally accepted, promising the money would be returned. Samuel smiled and changed the subject. For the first time in months, Ethan felt hope. He registered a smaller company, contacted former clients, and began working from the dining room table. Several people remembered the quality of his earlier work and agreed to meet. One contract arrived, then another. The recovery was slow, but it was real. Ethan became consumed with work again. And because Samuel never mentioned the money, Ethan almost accepted his explanation. Until one afternoon, while driving through town, Ethan automatically turned onto the street where Carter Auto Repair had stood for decades. The familiar building was still there, but the sign was gone. In its place was another company's name. Ethan slowed the car. For several seconds, his mind refused to make sense of what he was seeing. He parked and walked toward the entrance. Inside, the waiting area had been repainted. Samuel's battered desk was gone. The graduation photographs were gone. A man Ethan did not recognize asked whether he needed assistance. Ethan said he was looking for Samuel Carter. The man explained that Samuel no longer owned the garage. The sale had been completed several weeks earlier. Ethan felt the blood leave his face. He drove home faster than he should have, carrying the envelope in his mind and finally understanding what Samuel had meant by arrangements. When he entered the house, Samuel was sitting at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. Ethan did not remove his coat. He simply asked, "Dad, what happened to the garage?" Samuel folded the newspaper slowly. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then he admitted the truth. He had sold Carter Auto Repair, the garage he had spent almost 40 years building, the place where Ethan had sat with his tiny flashlight as a child, the business that helped pay for tutoring, school trips, university costs, hospital bills, and the house they were standing in. The garage Samuel once imagined expanding. The garage where Margaret sometimes brought dinner when he worked late. The garage where Samuel had placed Ethan's graduation photograph on the wall. Ethan struggled to understand. He asked whether the sale had funded the check. Samuel said yes. Ethan became angry, not because Samuel had deceived him, but because the sacrifice felt impossible to accept. He told his father he could have found another way. Samuel could have kept working or eventually sold the business for retirement. Samuel simply listened until Ethan's voice broke and the real question finally emerged. "Why would you give that up for me?" Samuel answered without drama. He said the garage was a building and a business. Ethan was his son. One could be sold. The other could never be replaced. Ethan stared at the man across from him and suddenly saw the past with brutal clarity. The faded shirts he had considered embarrassing existed partly because Samuel rarely spent money on himself. The old truck Samuel drove had helped keep Ethan's tuition account funded. The hands Ethan once worried his colleagues might judge had repaired thousands of cars so Ethan could sit in classrooms Samuel never entered. Even the garage Ethan had viewed as proof of a small life had quietly financed his entrance into a much larger one. Ethan sat down. There was another question he had avoided for years. and now there was nowhere left to hide from it. He asked Samuel whether he remembered the day outside the garage, when Ethan had been standing with his business associates. Samuel looked at him. Of course he remembered. Ethan tried to apologize, but the first attempt barely came out. He told Samuel that he had been ashamed, not because his father had done anything wrong, but because Ethan had become terrified of appearing less successful than the people around him. He admitted that he had looked at the man who sacrificed for him and seen old clothes instead of history. He had seen grease instead of labor. He had seen limited education instead of intelligence. Worst of all, he had treated Samuel like someone who did not belong in Ethan's new world when Samuel had sacrificed so much to help Ethan reach it. Ethan asked how Samuel could still help him after hearing those 3 words. Samuel was silent for a long moment. Then he explained that what Ethan had done hurt him deeply. There were nights he had thought about it. But one painful moment, he said, could not erase 35 years of being Ethan's father. I remembered what you said, Samuel told him. I just never stopped being your dad. That sentence accomplished what the business collapse had not. Ethan cried. Not the restrained tears of someone trying to remain composed, but the helpless grief of a man finally seeing the size of a debt no check could repay. He apologized for the missed calls, the shortened conversations, the holidays he skipped, the introductions he avoided, and every moment he had made Samuel feel smaller because Ethan wanted to appear bigger. Samuel did not pretend none of it mattered. Forgiveness did not erase the pain. But he told Ethan that regret was useful only if it changed what came next. Ethan remembered something Samuel had said when he left for university. Never be ashamed of where you started. For years, Ethan had interpreted success as distance. Distance from the old neighborhood, the garage, financial insecurity, and the limitations of his childhood. Now he understood that moving forward did not require disrespecting what came before. Progress was not supposed to erase gratitude. Ethan's second business grew slowly. This time, he refused to build his identity around appearances. He operated from a small office and maintained an emergency reserve before hiring aggressively. He accepted fewer invitations and spent more time understanding the people around him. Some former associates reappeared once they heard he was recovering. Ethan remained polite, but he no longer confused access with loyalty. The relationships he valued most became the ones that had survived when he had nothing impressive to offer. Every Sunday, whether traveling or working, he called Samuel. Sometimes the conversations lasted 10 minutes, sometimes an hour. He began returning home regularly. The first time Samuel visited Ethan's new office, Ethan walked him through every room. Several employees were present. Years earlier, that situation might have terrified him. This time Ethan called everyone together. He introduced Samuel Carter as his father, the man who had taught him more about business than any executive he had ever met. Samuel laughed and said he only fixed cars. Ethan corrected him. Ethan told them that Samuel had built a business from almost nothing and kept customers for decades because people trusted his word. He had survived economic downturns without abandoning employees. He had understood cash flow before Ethan learned the term in university. He knew reputation could take 30 years to build and 30 seconds to damage. He understood that work nobody applauded still mattered. And when Ethan's own company collapsed, Samuel had taught him that starting smaller was not the same as becoming smaller. Samuel stood quietly as Ethan spoke. His eyes became wet, but he looked down to hide it. Ethan noticed. For perhaps the first time since childhood, he felt proud without caring who was watching. The irony was painful. He had once worried important people would judge him for having a mechanic as a father. Now, after losing nearly everything, Ethan understood that Samuel possessed qualities many of those important people could never purchase. Loyalty, endurance, dignity, patience, and the ability to love without demanding an audience. Years later, Ethan would tell the story differently whenever someone asked where he came from. He no longer gave vague answers about his father owning a small business. He said Samuel Carter was a mechanic. He described Carter Auto Repair. He talked about the 2 service bays, the broken coffee maker, the old radio, and the stool where he used to sit with a flashlight. He told people that much of his education had been paid for one repaired vehicle at a time. Sometimes he even described the afternoon when he denied knowing his father. That part was difficult, but Ethan refused to hide it because he understood shame had caused enough damage already. He wanted younger entrepreneurs to know that success could alter their vision long before it altered their character completely. A person could become so busy impressing strangers that he stopped honoring those who loved him before there was anything impressive to see. Ethan knew because he had done exactly that.